Hello! Today we're going to be talking about supply and demand. Here on the y-axis we have the price. On the x-axis we have the quantity. Now we have the supply curve, which is upward sloping due to producers being more willing to supply more goods at higher prices. Now the demand curve is downward sloping, as it represents the inverse relationship between demand and price. Now, where supply and demand meet is the equilibrium, where it is most efficient for the price and quantity to be set. Shifters of supply include cost of inputs, disastrous events, technology, producer expectations, and government policy. Shifters of demand include change in income, preference, expectations, substitute complementary goods, and number of consumers.
Hello, and today we will be discussing the common trends of supply and demand: elasticity, deadweight loss, producer surplus, and price floor and price ceiling. Elasticity is how sensitive the supply or demand is in relation to changes in price. Price elasticity of demand is how sensitive quantity of demand is to change in the price of product. Price elasticity of supply is how sensitive quantity of supply is to change in price of product. When elastic demand or supply is less than 1, then it is inelastic. When elastic demand or supply is 1, then it is uninelastic. When elastic demand or supply is greater than 1, then it is elastic. When calculating price elasticity through change in quantity over change in price, you must take the absolute value into account and ignore the negative symbol. Here we have a demand example of price elasticity. Here we have a vertical line showcasing the perfectly inelastic curve, and we have the horizontal line showcasing the perfectly elastic curve. And here we have the diagonal curve showcasing the unit elasticity. Over here we have a supply example with the vertical curve showcasing the perfectly inelastic, and then we have the horizontal curve showing the perfectly elastic, and then we have the diagonal curve showcasing the unit elastic. And here we have producer and consumer surplus, where you can find consumer and producer surplus through finding where the equilibrium is and splitting it to where consumer is on the top and producer is on the bottom. To calculate the exact amount of surplus for each one must calculate the areas of the triangle with the formula 1/2 times base times height. For example, to calculate producer surplus here, it would be the distance from 0 to E multiplied by the distance from B to A multiplied by 1/2. Now here we have price floor and deadweight loss. As we can see here, this is cut off by the deadweight loss, as a price floor is set up here, and consumer surplus is here, producer surplus is here, where the price floor is set.
Right, so we're going to talk about some common trends now of the free responses that we saw in or talking about open market operations. So essentially, they want to know basically what was just mentioned in the basics of open market operations. A few things just to watch out for. Make sure you know exactly what they are. So federal funds rate. Or Fed funds rate is the rate we were talking about that banks charge each other. That banks charge each other for overnight loans. So that was the 10% that we had said in the previous example. But rate banks charge overnight. Overnight. And then the discount rate, make sure you know what that is. And that's essentially the interest rate charged by the Federal Reserves for loaning money. So IR charged by Feds when banks loan money or borrow money. Make sure you know about required reserves. I'm just going to do IRR. That's usually a percentage. Make sure you know how to, or basically the effects of required reserves, raising them or decreasing them. So basically raising a required reserve is going to, if you think about it, that's going to take away the amount of money in the in circulation, because, or not in circulation, but in the economy, because banks are going to have to hold more in their banks, which takes away from the money flow. So that is recessionary. And taking away would be expansionary. But you do get more securities, because why else would you need a required reserve? You get more security when you have a higher required reserve, because then the banks actually have the money rather than a false promise, which could either lead to economic problems or an economic crash. Basically, make sure you know effects on GDP. So we already kind of discussed this in the basics, but know that buying bonds is expansionary and would increase GDP, and selling bonds would be the opposite. And then based on the GDP and what that kind of affects the way the economy is going, know how this affects graphs like the Phillips curve and ADAS. And yeah, that's basically the trends. Open market's not too difficult. It's pretty predictable in terms of what they're going to ask you. Usually the answer we found was buying bonds. So keep that in mind, and you should be all right. All right, so we're going to talk about some open market operations. Sorry if the foaming is a little shaky. So let's go ahead and start with just the basic idea. So this is going to be monetary policy. And essentially what that means is we're talking about the central bank, rather than fiscal policy, which would be more like a government action. Monetary policy, really the main thing we're going to be talking about here is buying and selling bonds or securities. So basically, buying bonds is going to stimulate growth, and selling would basically be recessionary. So this is expansionary, this is recessionary. So right, expanse and recess. Cool. All right, recess. So let's talk about, so let's say there's, to give an example, let's say there's two banks, right? Let's say we have Bank of Apples and Bank of Oranges. Not related to the fruits, just the names. So let's say Oranges runs out of money, right? They're going to want to buy, or rather get money from Apples, because they need a required reserves, which is then set by the federal bank or central bank. So they're trying to get the required reserves. They're out of money, so they get a loan. This could be at, let's say, a little bit high, but 10% per year. And so basically by buying bonds, they're trying to lower the interest rate and basically lower demand for money and increase supply. And what that'll do is it'll in turn lower the interest rate. And when they, let's say, create more money, bloop, bloop. So that's them creating money. They are trying to do expansionary. And when they create more money, they can then buy bonds. And by buying bonds, they're giving more money here. And since the demand for money would be lower, the supply is going to be higher, and the interest rate goes down, and that'll cause for expansionary. So yeah, that's the basic idea of open market operations. So basically, know the general concept of that, and know know required reserves, and basically know what shifts the economy, and how it shifts it in terms of expansionary versus recessionary. What's up? All right, so we're gonna talk about Forex real quick. So yeah, that's foreign exchange. So we're gonna talk about some common trends, drawing the graph, knowing shifters of supply and demand, understand the concept of appreciation and depreciation, and know basically what that does in different situations, like how it affects the current account. Will a country import more or less from another country based on that? Yeah, so that covers the common trends. Pretty straightforward. Just know how to do these, and you'll be able to figure everything else out. So yeah, let's talk about, here's the, we're going to draw the graph. So some shifters of the graph, we have price level, income, interest rate, and consumer preferences. So yeah, all of those can shift the graph in certain ways. So let's just dive straight in. So over here, it's going to be yen over USD, and USD over yen, and this is going to be Q of yen and quantity of USD. Okay. So yeah, that's your labels. We're going to do supply and demand for each of these. Supply, demand, supply, demand. Essentially, know for supply and demand, whatever the country there is, that's what you're that's what you want to be supplying with. So actually, I should change these. These should be this should just be United States, and this should be Japan. So yeah, let's just do US, and we'll do Japan. There we go. So basically, supplying the US dollar would be US, and then this would be demand for the US dollar would be Japan, and then supply of the yen would be Japan, and the US would demand the yen. So there you go. And then basically an example of a shift. We can go to interest rate, and let's say interest rate goes up in the US. That would be a good thing. So basically the demand for so this is, let's just go ahead and say this is let's say the yen is super cool. So this is 1 to 2 and 2 to 1, right? Then let's say the demand, so the demand goes up for USD interest rate went up. So demand will go over here. D2. And that means basically there's an inverse relationship then. That means that supply for, or demand for this one would go down. And supply would basically go down. So let's do, our supply would go up, my bad. Supply for this one would go down. So the way to